Before we dive into the conversation with Rowena, a quick update. We're moving to a monthly release schedule, starting with our next episode. This change will allow us to bring you deeper insights and more well-researched discussions, ensuring each episode is as valuable as possible. With that, here's my conversation with Rowena. Enjoy.
We trained for all types of crisis events when we went to operational theatres like Iraq, but we could never actually plan for the actual event that we might find ourselves in. So it's being able to exercise enough of the corporate knowledge, corporate muscle memory, that you'll have guide rails in place that when an incident does occur, you'll have enough ability that's been trained in how to deal with it.
In today's fast-changing business environment, compliance professionals might have to deal with overlapping threats. Reputational risks, regulatory changes, and cyber threats can dovetail and present unique challenges for organizations, which is why a holistic, integrated approach to risk management is becoming more and more important. Today's guest, Rowena Fell, has a deep understanding of risk management. She spent 12 years in British military intelligence, building up experience and assessing risk in places as far afield as Northern Ireland, Bosnia, and Kosovo. And she followed that up with 17 years worth of experience in senior executive positions in industry. Now a senior director of knowledge at BCG, Rowena explains how her military experience has helped her in the corporate world and what organizations need for risk planning in an increasingly dynamic corporate environment. This is BCG on Compliance, a podcast that explores today's most pressing criminal trends and how compliance professionals are adapting to stay ahead of that curve. I'm Hanyo Seiber. So in your military experience, Rowena, did you ever have this quote unquote, oh shit moment? And do you think there's anything from that corporates could learn in terms of crisis management and remediation?
That's a great question. And I would say I had many of those moments. As an example, I served in Iraq. I served in Northern Ireland and Bosnia and Kosovo. Normally we say we served where you generally don't get to go on holiday. So normally those environments are full of those, to use your language, oh shit moments. It's about being prepared, quite ultimately. You can't plan for every eventuality, but you can plan to be ready. And that comes from a systemic approach to what you're planning for, so what you anticipate the risks to be. And then using good leadership, good prioritization, and being able to stay calm and ready in a crisis are all of those key skills that you bring over. As an example, I've been in business continuity and crisis management scenarios in industry where I have seen quite a few senior stakeholders be unable to operationalize what they're trying to do because they are so anxious and worried and lose sight of what their goals are to get themselves out of the environment that they're in. And so being able to have a really steady thought process, to be able to have that strategic mindset, that ability to step back and weigh up the problem before you get too tactical is really what you need to be doing when it comes to business continuity and crisis management.
Business continuity planning is crucial in compliance. It's not just about keeping the business running during a crisis, but also ensuring that regulatory requirements are still met, no matter the circumstances. I wanted to hear from Rowena about how her military background shaped her approach to assessing risks and whether there's a significant difference between military and corporate compliance planning.
So threat and risk are two terms that get used in the same way, but they're actually quite distinct. For me, my thought process always begins with threat. So threat is the capability of an adversary and their intent to cause harm. Now, that could be somebody who wants to conduct a cyber attack. It could be an employee who wants to cause some harm. It could be, unfortunately, a country that wants to go to war with a neighbor. You identify what your threat is. Once you know what your threat is, you then identify the risk. So the risk is the likelihood of that threat occurring. So if your threat is low, then you almost, in some way, don't even need to go through to the next step of the risk. If, however, the threat is medium or high, then you look at risk scenarios. So it's quite process-driven. And then the risk is the likelihood of that risk occurring and the level of harm that would be caused if that risk did occur. Those two equations are the same, whether they are in the military or in the corporate environment. It's just the type of risk that really changes and the type of jurisdiction. So I apply that methodology, and you'll see that methodology a lot in, say, cybersecurity type setting. You'll actually see it in information security, which is really what we talk about when we think about protecting personally identifiable information. Privacy is a class of information. We want to maintain the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of our assets. And we do that by understanding the threat to those assets and then understanding the likelihood of that threat occurring, which is the risk.
And when do you stop in the threat analysis? Because I can almost hear clients ask, like, okay, and I get it in the military context, you want to think about a lot of things and what could and what if scenarios, but in the corporate world, I can hear a lot of people already saying, oh, why are we spending time on thinking about what if? And where do you make the cut of a what if that is good to investigate whether it can occur and how it can occur versus something where you say, okay, I don't have organizational capacity to think down this path to evaluate this one?
It's a really great question, and I fully agree. And I have seen clients fall into the trap of over-analyzing, over-assessing, and then you're really then in an administrative burden without meaningful data of what you can do about it. So simplistically, the way that I look at it is, what is the driver? What is it you're trying to protect against? Is it that you want to enter a new market? So you need to make sure that your market entry strategy is right. Or it's that there is a new regulation that you know that you've got to be compliant to. And if you're not, it's got a significant fine associated to it if you're found to be non-compliant. So for me, it's about understanding what your drivers are, your business priorities. That's what sets what you do next. So to your point, you absolutely cannot, should not, must not try to do a threat analysis on every single situation or every risk. That makes no sense. For me, you want to be conducting analysis on those risks that prevent you from enabling your business and being very focused on what your priorities are. I've supported financial services clients where I've been part of a team that has conducted scenario analysis for a potential technology outage and how that might affect capital adequacy planning back to credit risk. And that you can see now how an operational risk touches on a regulatory risk. That's super important bit of work because you're mandated to conduct capital adequacy planning in some institutions. You have to make sure that you conduct really significant scenario analysis and planning, and you are going to get challenged on that by your operational risk and your compliance risk officers. So it's being able to prioritize those very important activities and then conducting your threat and risk analysis in relation to those. And then it's a repeatable process. As an example, if the process that you're reviewing is no longer going to be important in 12 months from now, then you might choose to look at it once or twice and then never again. You might have a process that is coming online in about 18 months. So you know that you don't necessarily need to assess for it now, but you're going to need to assess for it closer to the time. And then that's what we call, the life cycle management approach. And so it's all about that prioritization, focusing your resources effectively, and using data and technology to help you with that.
Have you seen approaches, or do you think it's possible to actually, quote unquote, simulate a crisis so that you don't need to have the actual crisis to create the awareness? Or in your experience, has it always been, well, there needed to be a blow up, minor or bigger, in order to move people and mindset and affect the change?
I would never wish anyone to have a crisis. And there is that nuance between a crisis and business continuity. Organizations don't necessarily understand the nuance between the two. So a crisis can really only ever be called by the C-suite because it's going to really affect market share. So share prices will fall. Business continuity is really an operational process that's potentially broken that needs to be resolved. So if we're talking in the terms of a crisis, can we exercise for them? Should we exercise for them? Should we plan for them? And the answer is yes. Do they get enough planning? In my experience, no. And I've sat in quite a few business continuity senior teams throughout my career. And I think I've been in industry, plus 20 years after the military. You need to get that muscle memory of what to do when it all goes wrong. You need to be able to have different levels in the organization that contribute to the recovery when an incident has happened. If you don't get that muscle memory, then what tends to happen is you'll see individuals in an organization all behave in disparate, uncoordinated ways, which means that you can't get to your end destination of trying to recover whatever it is that you're trying to recover from. What you won't be able to do, though, is replicate a crisis 100%. When I go back to the military, yes, we trained for all sorts of crisis events when we went to operational theatres like Iraq, but we could never actually plan for the actual event that we might find ourselves in. So it's being able to exercise enough of the corporate knowledge, corporate muscle memory, that you'll have guide rails in place that when an incident does occur, you'll have enough ability that's been trained in how to deal with it. So they could be very simple things. For example, who's going to take on the communications protocols? Who's going to take on reporting to regulator? Who's going to be in charge of making sure the IT gets fixed? Who's being the facilitator in the room to make sure that all of the relevant processes are being considered? Who's going to be the person that records all of the information, some form of secretariat, and making sure that you've got the right people identified as being in those right responsibilities and roles, also making sure you've got a good cascade system of how to get hold of those people, are key things that you can put in place so that if a crisis were to occur, you do have enough of a straw diagram to start a process off and have enough comfort that you can get off to a good enough start and you're not starting from scratch.
Perfect. I feel like I want to do kind of a boot camp in military risk planning or something without the full exposure there. But sounds super interesting. It's important to clarify here. Compliance risks refer to legal penalties from failing to meet external regulations, while operational risks can include anything from system outages to incorrect data entry. In heavily regulated industries like banking and big pharma, we're now starting to see companies merge these two concepts and bring them under one comprehensive risk umbrella. I wondered if Rowena had any insights into what might be driving this trend.
The operational risks, as they are known to organizations, now have a regulatory nexus to them, whereas historically they didn't. Now what we see with the advent of cybersecurity, technology risk, geopolitical tensions, is that there is an increasing threat landscape to our most valuable assets, whether they're physical assets or intangible assets like data. So when you consider third-party risk as an example, that's now driven by regulation. Third-party traditionally is an operational risk. So these symbiotic relationships, for example, Operational Resiliency Act, cybersecurity regulations or regulatory drivers from regulators and privacy regulations are all now pointing to the need for operational risk departments and compliance departments to come together to service the functions that they oversee. I know of a number of organizations at the moment that are looking to merge their compliance and operational risk departments into one oversight function to ensure that they do get full visibility of the risks in a efficient and effective way.
Are there also new challenges with creating a more holistic and more comprehensive risk management? And what are some of the big considerations here?
I mean, for example, you really need somebody in an organization to have the confidence and the ambition to, I would say, make a strategic pivot. And what do I mean by that? From an oversight function, risk officers will focus on particular risk verticals, and compliance officers tend to focus on regulation or on policy and procedure. There needs to be the ability to bring those two distinct or disparate functions together in this new climate. So you need capacity, our clients need capacity to be able to do that. But the challenge is that clients are trying to manage risk, deliver against operational risk frameworks, report on risk, whilst also trying to transform at the same time. And that's extraordinarily difficult. And arguably what I've seen is almost unable to happen together. You almost need a degree of separation. So you keep the lights on and you let somebody else help you to transform. So the challenges are around capacity. Do you actually have the resources and the headcount, the technology to actually enable you to transform? And then there's I would say respectfully, a talent gap. But what do I mean by that? So you tend to be an expert in the discipline that you cover off. So I think we need an industry going forward, and this is the confidence and ambition point, is we need to employ professionals who not only understand operations, but also operational frameworks and the regulatory landscape that those operations relate to.
What have been like some concrete examples of companies that have managed the transition well, in your perspective, the transition on getting a more strategic, more holistic business continuity, non-financial risk management across the organization?
Some of the clients I've had the opportunity to work alongside have been particularly in the financial industry sector and also in pharmaceuticals. They've had success in converging the models, in really being able to identify the risks that they are most concerned about that's pertinent to the organization. So as an example, for a financial institution organization, cybersecurity was elevated to a strategic risk out of an operational risk, driven by a regulatory requirement. And so decisions were made to merge the enterprise risk management frameworks that might pertain to cybersecurity. That involved operational risk and compliance departments coming together and actually redesigning a whole new risk assessment approach. And that risk assessment approach was really looking at the operational controls that were required to deliver the cybersecurity function, but mapping to those operational risks the corresponding regulatory risk. And that was new, that was key. You know, there are some frameworks out there that do that to some degree, but this particular organization understood all of its regulatory risks pursuant to these operational risks.
I think we're getting to the crux of the matter now. The concept of enterprise risk management that Rowena brings up here refers to having a holistic and organization-wide approach to risk management. Rather than keeping compliance, operational, and financial risks in silos, it integrates risk management into a single framework, potentially improving decision-making in that area of the business. Rowena sees this as the next innovation in risk management.
I think it's an interesting time for risk officers, whether they are risk officers that are looking after operational risks, strategic risks, regulatory risks, you know, the plethora of risks that are out there. And I think it's interesting because when you look at all of the risks that this world presents us with, we know that we can't possibly watch all of them, manage all of them, account for all of them. It's not possible. And so to be able to be now, I would say, almost at the forefront of being part of that community that helps to drive change in enterprise risk management, I see that as a critical tenet of where we are now and what we're starting to see clients do. I also think by being quite innovative and ambitious as a risk function, changing the way that functions operate, that you start to really get considered as being a part of the business enablement strategy for an organization and solidifying that status as a strategic partner to the C-suite. I've been in organizations where by the time the risk reporting has aggregated up to the C-suite level, it's almost meaningless because it's been so diluted. What we actually want to do is get to the stage where the meaningful, succinct reporting that we give to our very senior stakeholders really helps to drive good business decisions. And that's why I think it's an interesting time for risk officers.
Great. And if you think about emerging trends or technologies, what would you think organizations or risk management and compliance professionals should look out for? And what are some of the drivers of the big technology and analytical changes in the market?
Risk management functions don't tend to use technology to as much advantage as they could or they should for many different reasons. It could be costs, it could be knowledge and other things. I find it an interesting space because I've been on this journey myself personally, where I've been in a compliance role where the tech enablement didn't really match the mindset of some of the innovative, ambitious compliance officers that wanted, really to do more. I think we're now at a point in time where if we consider artificial intelligence, other systems and tools that are available, we can disrupt how we report on risk within an organization. We can help to unify the disparate systems, the different types of reporting into very meaningful bits of data that organizations can use to really understand risk. So instead of having many different systems within an organization that are reporting in silos, being able to bring those disparate systems together in one setup and then have AI or some other transformative process over the top of it can really create more efficiencies in the ability to report on risk. I have seen examples in financial institutions, in pharmaceuticals, in the military even to some degree, also in public sector, where the technology doesn't support the current environment. And you see lots of offline reporting going on. Individuals bringing in manual processes to try and get the reporting that they need in a format that they can then deliver to either their stakeholders internally or externally. And so I think it's a really exciting space for tech at the moment. And I'd love to see the AI space really evolve for risk and compliance officers.
Great. And Rowena, last question from me, just maybe 3 things you could think of that corporates or the private sector can still learn from risk management approaches in the military or public intelligence space.
So 3 things that risk managers can learn from the military. So if all else fails, have a sense of humor. Hopefully it doesn't get to that. I would say continued focused on priorities. Be commercial in the mindset so that you know the strategic vision of the organization that you support and align what you do back to those strategic priorities. So strategic priorities, alignment to them, and ruthless prioritization. And then if you allow me one other, ensure that you have the resources that you need to deliver. And then if all else fails, smile.
Perfect. Any final words from your end to our listeners?
I just enjoyed having the conversation, Hanya, with you. I look forward to how we see the enterprise risk management space evolve. And thank you very much for talking with me today.
Is your organization's risk management system well integrated, or is it in a silo? Join the conversation by connecting with us on your podcast app, writing a review of the show, or emailing us at bcgonCompliance@bcg.com. Be sure to subscribe to get more insights from compliance innovators. I'm Hanyo Seibert. Thanks for listening.